But we don't want to confuse it.
Formulating answers in rough terms.
Yeah. I've got time this weekend.
All stand. The Coronial Court now stands resumed. Please be seated. Thank you, Ella.
Your Honour, the witnesses this afternoon are Dr. Archie and Dr. Boffa, and I call those doctors.
Thank you. And we won't put you in the hot seat if you need your statement and it hasn't been provided yet.
It's just
It's all good. I had electronically.
Just starting with you, Dr. Archie, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
I do.
And Dr. Boffa, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
I do.
Thank you. Thank you for coming this afternoon and providing your time.
Just before I start, can I get through some formalities? Dr. Archie, can you please state your full name
Donna Marie Archie,
and your current employment position?
Chief Executive Officer
Where are you based?
in Alice Springs.
And you're the Chief Executive Officer of the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress.
That's right.
I'll come to what Congress is shortly. Dr. Boffa, your full name, please.
Dr. John Boffa.
And your current employment position with Congress?
I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Public Health.
I'm grateful to you both for reminding us of the public health measures that we've been failing to take often. Do you feel comfortable removing your mask to give evidence? Are you far enough distance apart? I was just thinking for the live stream it might be easier.
Yeah, we're comfortable with
Thank
that.
you very much.
I had my fourth injection before I came.
Excellent.
You're looking very well, Your Honour. So just before I finish really with the formalities, particularly for those who are listening into the evidence to understand your significant qualifications and experience, Dr. Archie, you and Dr. Boffa set these out in detail in your joint statement. You provided that statement. It's dated the 13th of September 2022, correct?
Correct.
So just going from that, I won't run through all of them, but starting with you, Dr. Archie, where did you commence your employment? Your early years as
Well, I came to Alice Springs in 1987. Initially employed at the Institute for Aboriginal Development, and then went on to be the Chief Executive Officer of Central Australian Aboriginal Congress in 1999.
And Dr. Archie, you have an honorary doctorate from Charles Darwin University, is that right?
That's correct.
And just in terms of some of your significant experience so that those listening understand, you are currently the chair of the Northern Territory Tripartite Forum on Children and Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance of the Northern Territory, known as AMSANT.
Yes, AMSANT, but then there's the Children and Families Tripartite Forum, and I'm the independent chair of that as well.
Thank you. And you've had experience on a board for many years, formulating policy, on directing policy.
Many years.
You're the former chair of the Aboriginal Benefits Account Advisory Committee.
That's correct.
Also the Literacy for Life Foundation.
Correct.
And a former director on the board of National Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisations, or NACCHO.
Correct.
You've also previously served as the CEO of that organisation.
Yes.
You are a former board member of the Australian National Advisory Council on Alcohol and Drugs.
Yes.
And just to take a number of your positions rather than go through all of them, you're an expert member of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Implementation Plan Advisory Group.
That's right.
Who does that group report to?
To the Commonwealth Chief Executive, Health Chief Executive.
And you represent Congress on the Alice Springs People's Alcohol Action Coalition.
That's correct.
I'll ask you about some issues relating to alcohol policy shortly. I just want to note that in relation to your experience, you've also been involved in research for many years and been the lead investigator in some key research projects which involve alcohol consumption and the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
That's correct.
You've got many years' experience as a CEO of different Aboriginal organisations, including, as I mentioned earlier, NACCHO from 2011 to 2012. And you were the CEO of the Institute for Aboriginal Development in Alice Springs from 1995 to 1999.
That's correct.
Dr. Achi, you're an Aboriginal woman. You've spent many years in Alice Springs. Where's your country from?
Yes, I'm a proud Bundjalung woman from the far north coast of New South Wales. My grandmother's from a place called Cabbage Tree Island, which is just near Lismore. And I've been living here on Central Aranda country for over 30 years.
Thank you, Dr. Achi. Can I, before I delve deeper into some of those qualifications and how you've put them to use, Dr. Boffa, when did you first come to the Northern Territory?
February the 22nd, 1988. February 21st, actually, 1988.
Doctor, you're a medical doctor, is that right?
Yes.
You are currently the Chief Medical Officer of Congress, and you've been in that role since the year 2000. You've had a longer history with Congress, though, is that right?
Yes, since 1994.
What was your first role in Congress?
Medical officer for 1 year, and then senior medical officer from 1995, then public health medical officer from 2000, then chief medical officer public health.
Dr. Boffa, prior to that, you were the senior medical officer in Tennant Creek, is that right?
Yeah, from 1988 to 1994.
You set out in your statement helpfully various qualifications and awards. They include in 2012 Northern Territory Australian of the Year for your research and reform with alcohol and early childhood illness, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
You note also that in your various roles in Aboriginal health over many years, you've worked with Aboriginal health leaders on significant Aboriginal health policy developments, and that included the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991.
Yeah, that's correct.
You're involved in the development of the Aboriginal community-controlled primary health care documents in many respects, including the development of the CARPA manual, the Standard Treatment Guidelines.
Yes, that's true. The first edition.
CARPA is the Central Australian Rural Practitioners Association.
Yes, it is.
And that's the manual that's still used today. In its
Yes, it
various
is.
editions.
Yeah, it's a very important way in which practitioners make sure they're practicing in accordance with best practice evidence.
Specifically related to assisting practitioners in a rural or remote setting.
Yeah, and Aboriginal primary healthcare, but rural and remote primary healthcare, but more specifically Aboriginal primary healthcare.
In 2016, you were both awarded the Australian Medical Association Award for Excellence in Healthcare, a joint award to both of you.
Yes, that's true.
Might I ask first about the background to Congress? Dr. Achi, this is set out in the statement from paragraph 14, but in your words, would you mind just telling us what Congress is?
Congress is a Aboriginal community-controlled primary healthcare service, and we're turning 50 next year. It originally was established to be the voice of Aboriginal people in Central Australia, and it wasn't until 2 years later in 1975 that the genesis of a medical service with the employment of a doctor, a receptionist and a bus driver, which was the start of what we've got today, which is a comprehensive primary healthcare service, which goes from, quality antenatal care, early childhood, through to early detection and management of chronic disease, through to looking after our old people through our frail, aged and disabled program. But what's equally important as part of primary healthcare is our role in advocacy.
And I'll break some of those different roles down. In terms of the geographical area that Central Australia, that Congress covers?
Yeah, we go as far west as Mutijulu, which is about just over 500 kilometres away. We go east as far as Gingerporta, Santa Teresa, as well as more closer to town, about 22 k's out at Amungana. And we also provide services out west at Uchu, Arionga, and a joint service at Endari and Wallace Rockhole.
I think I've looking at your statement and that evidence, it's in terms of the actual clinics you are in control of, it's 5 remote clinics serving 6 communities.
That's right.
And of course, the additional services in terms of advocacy affect the whole of Central Australia, is that right?
Yes, and sometimes NT and sometimes nationally.
In relation to additional services, could you please tell us about Headspace and Congress's involvement with Headspace?
Well, Headspace we're one of 3 in the country where Headspace is located within an Aboriginal community-controlled primary healthcare service. We were the first in the country, and it is for young people that have issues around mental health, but we advocated for Headspace to be part of a comprehensive primary healthcare service so that it could have those wraparound support services. And it is a service that we provide to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal young people.
And is that service provided in the clinics that are currently operated by Congress?
No, the Headspace that we currently run at the moment is for Alice Springs, but we have negotiated and are establishing an outreach service to Murrujulu.
And is it a service which is online, or does it involve people physically going out to the community?
It'll physically go into the community.
Is that a service that you would like to see with more funding and resources accessing different communities?
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about the youth outreach teams and where they currently operate?
Our youth outreach team is mainly in Alice Springs and is sort of integrated as part of our Back on Track program, which is dealing with young people that have been, part of the juvenile justice system, and it's really a youth diversion program to keep kids out of youth detention.
Do the youth outreach teams then become, or some people are nominated as case workers for individual clients?
Yes.
And can they then go into the remote areas where the clients are?
Well, we're not funded to do remote areas, so at the moment it's only based in Alice Springs in terms of our youth services.
Is that a service that you think would be useful to fund to go into remote communities?
Absolutely.
In terms of being able to offer that service, if you were going to have people living in communities like Yuendamu, you'd need to work with government to accommodate them? Firstly.
Absolutely.
I might return to that. Can I ask you about the best practice model that you refer to? And Dr. Boffer, I might perhaps turn to you for this. At paragraph 26, you note that in 2003, Congress took over issue in Arayonga from the Northern Territory Department of Health, and that's now widely recognised as a model of best practice in remote communities. Just before I ask you about why or what is it that distinguishes the practice of Congress, Dr. Achi, I wonder if you could just explain what are the models. Some healthcare is provided by Northern Territory Health, some by Congress. How is that determined?
Well, in Congress's situation, it was driven by the local community to want to have their own Aboriginal community-controlled health service. And that happens across the Northern Territory, and there is a current policy of the Northern Territory Government and the Commonwealth, with the support of the Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance of the NT AMSAT, for the transition of NT government clinics to Aboriginal community control. So there's been a history of Congress in actually supporting communities to transition, either transition clinics to community control or to establish their own Aboriginal community controlled health service.
Just before I move on to the actual model, can I ask you about some of the history relating to Yuendamu? In your joint statement from paragraph 30, you and Dr. Boffer outline the service provision to Yuendamu. And I'll direct this question to you, Dr. Achi, and Dr. Boffer, I'll just ask you at the end if there's anything you want to add to this before we come back to the actual service provision. From late 2002, Congress provided the Wallara Yundamu Nirapi Health Zone with primary healthcare services through an auspice agreement in conjunction with the Wallara Yundamu Nirapi Health Board and the Northern Territory Government. Was that in effect Congress being responsible for the provision of health services, or was it a joint model?
No, we were actually responsible for elements of it was actually a dual because there was still the Aboriginal the NT government clinic, and we were funded directly from the Commonwealth to provide GP service, a GP and other related staff.
So the clinic is still owned by NT Gov, is that
Yes.
right? And Congress is in effect contracted to provide the health service?
The health, not the whole health service.
I see, part of the health.
Yeah.
The primary health service, is that right?
Do you want to explain it, Bob?
I think,
I think it's a bit like Indari, isn't it?
yeah, so Congress is funded to complement what existed through the Territory Government Clinic, which was largely remote area nurses and Aboriginal health workers. So Congress was given additional funding from the Commonwealth Government under the Primary Healthcare Access Program to, importantly, to employ GPs, because Community Control Health Service always have GPs within the service as part of the model, not just a nurse, Aboriginal health worker only service model. So Congress received those additional resources to employ a lot of additional staff who worked alongside the Territory Government clinic staff to provide a comprehensive primary healthcare service in its total. Yeah, but it was a dual provider service model. And it happened in an era under the Primary Healthcare Access Program where the Northern Territory had been divided up into 21 health zones. And so each of those health zones, it was thought, would end up with their own community control health service. So it was originally thought that the Wynn area would become a community control health service. But then by about 2007, with the success of larger regional Aboriginal health services like Catherine West Health Board and Sunrise, the health planners decided there was a minimum population that you needed to get economies of scale to have an effective comprehensive primary healthcare service. So those original health zones were deemed to be too small. And so that was an issue for transition for places like the area like Wynn would need to become part of a larger service to develop a community control health service.
And so this is part of what you very helpfully, there's a slide from the Congress orientation program which shows the way in which the services that Congress helped to set up over time. If we have a look then at paragraph 36 of your statement, you explain that a planning document from June 2009, so 7 years after Congress started with that joint agreement, there was a planning document which explained the arrangement that Wynn Health, under the auspice of Congress, funded by the then Office of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health, a Commonwealth Government department, was funded to deliver primary health care services to Yundamu, Nirapi and Wallara. These services were provided at the community health centres based in each community, operated by the NT Department of Health and Families through the Central Australia Remote Health Services. So there's obviously some complex health planning and bureaucracy that goes into this, but at that time, the staffing profile provided by Wynn under Congress is set out at paragraphs 37 and 38. There's a very significant number of positions that were added to the core clinic positions as a result of Congress's involvement. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you said earlier, Dr. Boffa, it's essential in the Congress model for general practitioners to be involved rather than nurse-led.
Yeah, and in fact, we were guided then by the Central Australian Health Planning Study, which was a joint study commissioned by Commonwealth Territory and the Aboriginal Medical Service Alliance. That study set out population staffing ratios for primary health care. So it said there should be one GP for every 400 people in a remote community, one nurse for every 250 people, and one Aboriginal health worker for every 100 people. So we started to build. In 2001, the primary healthcare system funding levels in Central Australia ranged from $350 per person, Lake Nash, to around $1,500 per person in Elliot. So this funding it was inequitable and inadequate. So this funding was designed to both increase the absolute level of funding and obviously the number of staff, as well as achieve equity across the region. And it started to achieve that. So you can see that sort of boost is starting to get to something like what you need for a population of 900 people who have a significant degree of illness to be able to deliver an effective primary healthcare service. And importantly, that included resident GPs, and it was Dr. Russell Thompson and Dr. Alakajensky, and then one was replaced by Dr. Rodney Jones. So there were 2 resident GPs in that community the whole time we had the service, and they're part of a team. But you need GPs as part of your team, and the more remote you are, the more it's important that they're resident. Because fly in, fly out, you just lose too much of the clinical service delivery time and too much of the capacity of GPs to contribute to the whole team in the community.
And does it, in terms of recruitment, having 2 GPs who are based in the community, does that make it easier to in fact attract other people in the workforce?
Absolutely. All health professionals want to work in an effective team, and these days that includes social workers, psychologists, nurses, Aboriginal health workers, GPs. It's an incredibly challenging environment that people work in. It's incredibly rewarding and it's a great privilege to work in it, but it's challenging. But if you're working in an effective team, every problem with the community, with Aboriginal people from the community as part of that team, everything you're dealing with can be addressed. So it's a really important retention strategy to have an effective team. If you go into a service where there aren't enough staff and everyone's overworked, you'll have turnover.
So it becomes a self-perpetuating problem, doesn't it? The fewer staff you have, the more difficult it is to attract people and keep them there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you recall at that time, trying to remind myself what your position was at that time, Dr. Boffa, you involved with Congress, I think, as the Chief Medical Officer. You've been in the role since year 2000.
I was a public health medical officer at that time.
Do you recall any difficulties in relation to attracting staff or keeping them at that time?
Oh, yeah, look, one of the doctors was an international medical graduate. He trained in Russia, then got qualifications in Europe, came under the Michael Woolridge IMG program, which was a brilliant way to get doctors into remote communities. Unfortunately, we've still got that program, but just recently the government made the great decision to allow them to practice in MM2 locations. So that's Caroline Springs in Melbourne, is the same as Kintore for attracting international medical. That's almost gutted it in terms of remote communities. But we had one doctor then from the IMG program. One of the doctors was a non-VR GP. He was a surgeon who then decided to leave surgery and become a general practitioner. As a non-VR GP in those days, he was only allowed to work to attract Medicare in an MM5 or 6 that's remote and very remote. So he came for that reason. He was very good. And non-VR GPs can be incredibly effective because they're often older doctors who've had a lot of experience. And one doctor, the third one, Russell Thompson, attained his fellowship while working for us. So he was Australian. He was the only Australian, well, no, not the only, there are 2 Australians, but he was the only proper general practitioner who got his fellowship, but while working for us through what's called the Remote Vocational Training Scheme, which is a scheme that allows doctors to train to fellowship from one remote community. And so you've got to use every avenue to get doctors into remote communities, and international medical graduates is one avenue. You've got to offer GPs effective training to fellowship level, and you've got to look at non-VR GPs. But unfortunately, all those avenues in recent times have started to dry up because with the GP shortage, governments are more worried about the outer metropolitan areas of Melbourne and Sydney than they are about the remote communities. So we're at a very difficult situation now.
There's been some recent publicity, I note, on the GP shortage around the country. Both of you are highly experienced and I know may well have an ear still to different government bodies. Is that information being fed up to the federal government?
Absolutely. Constantly.
With solutions.
I know Her Honour's powers don't extend to the Commonwealth, but no doubt you'd be happy.
But if she does want to solve the GP workforce crisis, we'd be very welcome.
But no doubt you'd be happy for it. That doesn't stop us passing on any information that you've got. So no doubt you'd be happy for us to pass that on to the federal government if you think it would be of assistance. In relation to those creative strategies, then I take it that Dr. Achi and Dr. Boffa, you're currently engaged for the health services that you are covering to think creatively about other ways to ensure that you can have GPs servicing communities.
Yes.
In relation to the communities that you currently service, the 5 remote clinics serving 6 different communities, is there a general practitioner at each of those communities?
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, there's general practitioners full-time in Mutijulu, Alginjapora, and Dari. And we do, at Uchi, which is a community of 230 people, there's 2 days a week of a GP time. And at Mungana, there's full-time. The one of all those communities, we have one permanent vacancy at Mutijulu, which is about to be filled. It's been for 12 months. We've had to use locums. That's about to be filled by an international medical graduate, and I'm pleased to say it looks like we've poached her from an MM2 location in the capital city, going remote. That's not what's happening. They're all leaving remote to go to MM2 locations in capital city. So this is against the trend.
Do you want to tell us, Dr. Boffer, about what are the advantages, think of this as a recruitment campaign, to working remotely? Because we've already heard from nursing staff that you get an opportunity to engage in a wide variety of practice remotely, and of course the privilege of working with Aboriginal people on country.
Yeah, and so it's a very interesting and challenging work environment. There's a lot of varied work. You're part of a team. You really make a difference. People are sick but do respond very well to chronic disease management. It's very effective, so you can make a big difference in people's lives. But you get welcomed. You become part of a community. You learn a different culture. It's a really great experience, and I concur that there's been some publicity from this hearing which is quite negative. And one thing I'd really like to mention is non-Aboriginal health professionals never get subject to payback. That's just nonsense. Payback is something that there's particular laws around, and it's practiced in a particular way in accordance with very strict rules and laws and traditions, and it works within the Aboriginal community. It's not practiced on non-Aboriginal health professionals. So health professionals who go out there will be welcomed. If they try their hardest and do their best, they'll be even welcomed more. If mistakes happen, and they do, people are very understanding of those mistakes when they're genuinely made. There's none of this, you don't need to worry about that sort of it's just nonsense. I think it's really damaging to have that out there, and that has been in the media, so I think that's worth addressing. So by and large, it's a great opportunity. People are in some services settings, they're well supported. The work's challenging, but they make a difference, and you make a big difference. You're not working with the worried well, you're working with people in which medicine makes a big difference, and also you're working in a structure where you can not only treat sick people and make them well, but you can actually think about what are the structural determinants of illness and what can we do about that, which is where Donna's point about advocacy becomes very important. But in some service models, advocacy is much more possible than in others. It's a lot harder to advocate as an employee of the state.
Dr. Achi, particularly as an Aboriginal person, can I pick up on something that Dr. Boffer has talked about there with payback? I know from speaking to some of Kumanjayi's family members and community that they feel offended by the concept, by payback being used as a concept that non-Aboriginal people just don't understand and use in a way that is inappropriate. Is that something that you'd like to comment on too?
Oh, I think I absolutely support the family's view about that, and I support what Dr. Boffer has just said about it, that it's been misused inappropriately in this context.
Can I just refer back to Yundamu and the staffing ratio? Dr. Boffer referred to some ratios before. Roughly, this is back in 2009, 1 GP for every 400, 1 nurse for every 250 people. And I can't read my own scribble, Dr. Boffer, 1 Aboriginal health worker.
For every 100.
Are those ratios still appropriate?
That's like the gospel according to primary healthcare service planning, if you like. If you like, some would see it as an asymptotic goal, but I think it's still, it's something we work towards, and we're certainly conscious of it, and we try, and this is where coming back to Uchu, you look at Uchu, why Uchu is considered to be an exemplar is it's a community of 230 people, there's 4 nurses, there's a GP 2 days a week, and there's an Aboriginal health practitioner, there's an Aboriginal liaison officer, there's a part-time cleaner, so that's a well-resourced primary healthcare service in a community of that size, when in other communities like that they're under the health department, their clinics have been closed since the middle of last year because of COVID. similar size or even larger communities actually have a visiting service only now, with no one permanently in the community. So people look at Butcher and think, wow, we want what they've got, which is good. I think that's what people should be saying. They should be aspiring towards that level of healthcare, given the level of need. And the other point to make is, from 1999 to 2018, an article just published in the MJA shows that territory-wide, Aboriginal men's life expectancies improved 9 years and Aboriginal women's improved 5 years. The improvements have been bigger in Central Australia, and it's all due to primary health. It's not just primary health care, it's the health system that's made the difference, along with opal unleaded and alcohol reform. So if the primary healthcare system goes backwards, this has happened in a period where the other social determinants have not improved. So educational outcomes, educational participation, early childhood development, overcrowding, unemployment, income, poverty, they haven't changed. But we've still seen that sort of improvement, which is very significant. But if the health system starts to collapse, which it's doing now, we'll go backwards very quickly. And we just saw in another article in the MJ a few weeks ago that in the health department's clinics, of all their chronic disease patients, over 70% haven't seen a doctor in 12 months, in more than 12 months, and 90% are not picking up their medications. So that's a very rapid, and therefore end-stage renal failure has increased 20% in the last 12 months in government clinics. So I think we can very quickly go backwards if we're not very, very aware of the crisis we're in and the need to address it properly.
The end-stage renal failure has increased in the Northern Territory or across Australia?
That's Central Australia, in territory government clinic communities. I'm not saying it hasn't increased in community control clinic communities. We haven't got that data, so it could be across the board. But that's a major concern. We should all be absolutely incredibly concerned about that, and we should be doing everything we can to get the workforce we need. And we heard yesterday in evidence a 25% nursing shortage, and then you add to that the GP shortage, and the Aboriginal health practitioner shortage is absolutely much worse. And you've got a workforce crisis like we haven't seen since the mid-90s, at a time when we know what a difference access to primary health care makes.
In relation to the crises in the availability of Aboriginal healthcare workers, what do you think the reason for that is? Dr. Archie?
Well, there was a change many years ago to have an Aboriginal health practitioner, so raise the actual entry level and qualification. So we went from Aboriginal health worker basic skills to being an Aboriginal health practitioner in terms of registration. So that, with all the good intentions about increasing the clinical capacity, what it did in the end is that it actually decimated the Aboriginal health worker, Aboriginal health practitioner workforce in the Northern Territory. So we've actually gone backwards, and it's a structural thing that needs to be addressed. And that's because we've moved away from the Aboriginal health worker basic skills training program, and there's, to become an Aboriginal health practitioner, you've got to be, at a certain level in terms of educational capacity. So when you look at the Northern Territory in terms of educational disadvantage, it just put the, Aboriginal people, the number of Aboriginal people that could train to be an Aboriginal health practitioner was going to be dramatically reduced. So we're advocating for a return back to the future of the basic skills Aboriginal health worker, and that's where you'll have more Aboriginal language speakers, getting them back into the health clinics.
And Dr. Archie, Dr. Boffa talked about a Commonwealth initiative that has had adverse unintended effects. Is this a territory government initiative?
No, this was a national reform, a national reform.
And when was it introduced?
1990, so quite a long time ago. And so Bachelor College took over all the training. Originally they did it in partnership with Aboriginal Health Services, and that started to work quite well, but then those partnerships stopped, and they've been trying to do it on their own. They've come back to trying to do partnerships with health services, but the number of graduates, it'd be less than 5 a year. For a very long time, we've had less than 5 graduates a year for about 15 years. And so you can't, so we've gone from over 400 registered health workers to well under 200 now, territory-wide.
So is there action that the Northern Territory government could take? I'm thinking particularly because you understand that Her Honour has a recommendations power that can be directed to the Northern Territory government. Is there lobbying that you're trying to do at that level?
Yeah, well, I think we need to return to the basic skills Aboriginal health worker training program. And that's an entry level, certificate level 2. And then there can be pathways into, level 4, certificate level 4 Aboriginal health practitioner. But we've got to come back and invest at a lower level in community.
And I was just going to add, we need about 50 traineeships a year. So that plus the funded positions, because in the old days, health workers used to say someone would be identified to be a health worker, they'd go and sign up with DEET in those days. They'd get a training wage and they'd learn on the job. So it's a combination of being able to employ them while they're training and learning on the job with some extra support from places like Bachelor would really get us back to a situation where we've got that critical workforce. But that plus nurses, plus doctors, never that. In the bad old days, you'd have remote clinics with health workers only, trying to do everything. That's certificate, well, not even certificate 4. So that's not where we want to go. It's a team-based approach, and they're an essential part of the team.
I'm going to say 2 things that I'm going to suggest are trite and common sense. One is that the more Aboriginal workers that you have, the better for all staff, Cardia and Yappa, to be able to manage that clinic. And
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
the more buy-in you're likely to get from the community in terms of respecting and valuing their
Exactly.
service.
And you've got to have an active Aboriginalisation policy, which at Congress that's what we've got, and we've got a very deliberate policy in terms of training and professional development to invest in Aboriginal people and Aboriginal staff. The other thing that I want to pick up on in terms of training is not just at the entry level training, but there's also a need in terms of health professional qualifications. So if we want to get more Aboriginal doctors, more Aboriginal psychologists, more Aboriginal nurses, then we've also got to increase the access to cadetships as well. And I think that's something that needs a good look at as well. And at Congress, just to give some data and how serious we take this about Aboriginal employment, is that 61% of our workforce is Aboriginal when you take out health professionals, and we've got a 30% of our leadership team is Aboriginal, and we've got a target at 40%. So it makes a big difference in terms of making sure that we've got Aboriginal leadership and with an Aboriginal board control.
And I'll come back to the Aboriginal board control in one moment. The employment of Aboriginal people in a clinic setting and other settings too, I suggest, also has a flow-on effect for the community that's really important in terms of improving community health overall.
Exactly, and they're our contacts as well to the community as well. Yeah,
And it's an intergenerational health development strategy, because there's recent evidence that employment amongst parents could be the principal determinant of school attendance. So it has an important, if your parents are working, then the next generation get a great benefit from that. So it's a double whammy. It's the health service needs these people to be culturally safe and effective right now. And then through their employment, their families benefit. So that the next generation of children have role models, parents working, and working parents are more likely to want children to be in childcare, to be at school, and that has a huge impact on it. So, you know, it's a really important strategy, and the starting wage is a great way to begin.
And then, Dr. Archie, you just mentioned answerable to an Aboriginal board, is that right?
Yes.
What are the benefits of that?
well, they're connected directly to the community, direct input. I remember many years ago, before we introduced an appointment system at Congress, the board meetings were constantly talking about the waiting times. So that was direct input to the board about what was going on the front line in the clinic. So that obviously got attention after time, but that's a direct way in which community clients, patients and the community can have direct input into the service and have their issues addressed.
We have a lot of material in the inquest that supports the community wanting to be empowered, or in some circumstances it's expressed as being re-empowered to have control over services that are going into the community. Is having an Aboriginal control board an important way of doing that?
Well, it's an expression of self-determination, and it's key as one of the priority reforms for the closing the gap. So, having Aboriginal people in control and directing and taking responsibility is one of the key reflections of self-determination. So we absolutely support Aboriginal community control of primary health care.
Do you see the benefit of having an Aboriginal control board to the non-Aboriginal staff as well as the community?
Absolutely. And it's being part of an organisation or a service as non-Aboriginal people. They actually learn. It's two-way. It's we get non-Aboriginal knowledge and they get to reflect. They get to be part of working in a cross-cultural environment and getting, learning new things from local Aboriginal people, and being under the control of Aboriginal people. It's a new thing for some people and it's a bit hard to get used to, but at the end of the day, it is about Aboriginal people taking responsibility.
One of the, I'm not sure if you had the opportunity, I know how busy you both are, to listen to any of the evidence this week, but if I could just ask you to accept from me that some of the evidence that's come out is that the workforce in Yuendumu currently and in 2019 at the time of Kumanjayi's death spent most of the time outside of work hours socialising within themselves, and they did not have much to do in terms of socialising with other stakeholders, and they didn't in fact spend much time in the community other than one nurse who had a son at school. Do you think it's important for staff to be able to connect with other service providers, both socially and within the clinic?
Absolutely, and that is what happens in our remote locations. And our staff are actually embedded as part of the community. So, and the community looks to the health clinic to be part of what's going on in the community and to be supportive and to help. So it's staff that work in the clinic that extend beyond the clinic in terms of their engagement with the community, and it's also in the community being seen as a health centre, as an entity that we are there to support the community as well in broader activities and with other providers.
We've heard that the orientation process for nursing staff in Yuendumu was to spend some time with the Aboriginal health worker being taken around for the day, for example, looking at different sites where they should and shouldn't go. But beyond that, there weren't regular Walpre classes and there wasn't a regular orientation process that they attended. Are there strategies that Congress uses to ensure that people are embedded in the community? Absolutely.
We've got operating cultural protocols for each of our remote clinics. We have a cultural orientation that's held regularly for new starters. We also have one-on-one for new staff when they first start with our 2 senior cultural advisors, male and female. And we also see that our Aboriginal staff, around 200 of them, are a source of advice to non-Aboriginal people that come and work in our service.
I'll take you shortly to the document that Congress has prepared in terms of dealing with a temporary reduction in services. In terms of managing any conflict or any perceived risk to staff at a clinic, is the model that you've talked about with an Aboriginal board one that makes it easier to have Aboriginal people assist in managing the problem?
Absolutely, and we've had a recent example of where there was a level of unrest in the community and the impact that was having and being brought into the clinic. We talked about strategies to manage that, and that was in consultation with the staff, but more importantly, it was actually in consultation with the board. So even though Congress has its main Aboriginal directors and board, it is equally as important that we speak to the local leadership in that community with that board. So those strategies were discussed and sought their advice on those strategies, and of which they were supported. So then we operationalised those strategies. So it was a combination of both local Aboriginal leadership seeking their advice, as well as the staff that work in the actual clinic.
You're referring to the instance in Mutijulu in 2021,
yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And I'll take you back there briefly shortly. Just before I leave the history of Yundamu in terms of Congress's involvement, you note in your joint statement at paragraph 42 that towards the end of 2009-2010 period, the WIN Health Board, which serviced Balaura, Yundamu and Nirapi, notified Congress of its intentions to cease the auspice arrangements, and RHS, the Congress Remote Health Service Branch, facilitated the transfer and staff of assets to the Northern Territory Health Department. And since that time, is it the case that the NT Health Department has provided that primary service alone?
Yes.
Do you know why that occurred?
Well, it was we support self-determination, so it was a decision of the WIN board to want to return to return back to the Department of Health, and so we supported that decision.
In your statement, you set out clearly what the steps are to take for a community who wishes to return to Congress being in control of the primary service. Have you received any approach from Yundamu to date?
There's been some verbal reports to us, and that's happening in a number of Central Australian Aboriginal communities, actually. So Yundamu is not the only community that is asking Congress for their assistance and for us to provide primary healthcare services. So I think there is a genuine need to think and, strategically transition NT government clinics in Central Australia for those communities who want to come across to Congress, that we need to elevate this in a strategic way, because doing it piecemeal, one here, one over there, a couple of clinics here, it's become, I think we've done enough now to know what needs to be done. We need to get on and do it and make it happen, but do it strategically. So it's a shift of not just a piecemeal shift, but an overall significant shift. And because the other a point that was made earlier around the complexities, especially when you've got 2 providers in one community, that's something that Congress has always said is a challenge, and the preference is to have one provider. So you either have an NT government clinic or you have Aboriginal community control. It is way too difficult to have both.
At the moment, in terms of the outline of what you're currently providing with the 5 remote clinics servicing 6 communities, did you say there was one of those models where it is joint at the moment?
That's right.
And is that the Ginger Porter model?
No, it's Wahak,
It's
Western
Wahak.
Arundel.
In Hermannsburg.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think you note in your statement also you're in the process of transitioning 3 other community clinics that will
That's
be
right.
completed by 2023. Which are those clinics?
It'll be March next year for Emampa and Ulara, and then July will be Docker River.
And staying with Yuendamu just for a moment, in relation to paragraph 37 where you set out the staffing profile provided by the Member Congress for Yuendamu back in the 2000s, is that a similar, what we see there, just to remind everybody listening, 2 resident general practitioners rather than 1, which is the situation currently. You also refer there to a male health coordinator, a female health coordinator, maternal and child health coordinator, 3 Aboriginal community workers, as well as an Aboriginal health worker and Aboriginal liaison officer, 2 mental health counsellors, and 2 receptionists and a hearing health worker. Is that the sort of staff to community member ratio that you foresee if Congress was to take over that service?
Oh, I might not be in that.
Yeah, you'd have to add, don't forget the remote area nurses and the Aboriginal health workers. At that time, from memory, there were 5 remote area nurses and 7 Aboriginal health practitioners, I think, with the Territory Government Clinic. So when you put all that together, these days you might not have the hearing health worker, you might make it more generic, but it's a very similar, you've got to have enough Aboriginal people to make a difference. It's not just Aboriginal health practitioners. Aboriginal liaison officers, community workers became necessary because, as Donna said, the language-speaking local people couldn't get certificate for. So there's a whole new workforce out there, Aboriginal community workers, Aboriginal family support workers, Aboriginal liaison officers, who are critical to being able to deliver a culturally safe service now in the absence of the old basic skills Aboriginal health workers. So when you put that sort of team together, 900 people, 1 nurse, you're getting close to the sort of level that you need to do it properly. But I think the really key here is a model of health service delivery that gets over the problem of Commonwealth state cost shifting, which is community control. Once the money's with the community controlled health service, even if a position's unfilled, you don't lose the money. But with the trouble for Aboriginal health immemorial, I've been involved 34 years now, we have not solved the problem of Commonwealth state cost shifting. The Northern Territory Framework Agreement and the Aboriginal Health Forum was meant to try and do that. But I think until we have either one government, which is not coming, or one health system with funds pooling, there'll always be the problem as the Commonwealth puts money in, states take money out if they can. And that's, I think, what we've seen in Yuendamu, and that doesn't happen. When you've got a community controlled health service, the money is with the community, controlled by the community, and it's there and it's transparent and it won't go anywhere. And you know what you've got per capita, it can't be. It's another really big benefit of community control. It is, I think it is the only way in the current structure of our governments to stop cost shifting.
Does that money come into Congress from both the Commonwealth and the Territory, but it's held by Congress for distribution?
Yeah. And you can't just move it around depending on budget priorities and budget deficits and other ways in which savings are generated.
And the other important way of getting financial resources into the community is the MBS. And the way we treat MBS is that wherever that MBS is generated, it stays in that community. So if MBS money is generated in Mutijulu, it stays in Mutijulu. They make the decision about and contribute to the discussion about where that MBS money should be allocated to.
Dr. Archie, MBS Medicare benefit scheme?
Yes, right.
And so you envisage a workforce, I don't want to put you on the spot, but of around 27 staff for Yuendamu if Congress was to take over that health service?
Well, exactly. If the money should still be there unless the Commonwealth no, this is Commonwealth money that came to Congress that went across to the NT government. So yeah, that's right. That should still be in the NT government system. Exactly.
And just in relation to those ratios, what we hear from NT Health is that they have unfilled positions currently. So, for example, a psychologist position exists within the structure. There was originally Kerry Ann Chilvers in that position at the time, prior to Kumanjayi passing, and then they were able to fill it with one psychologist after. Would you excuse my back for one moment? I think for a considerable period of time, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but for at least over 12 months, they have not been able to fill a position of psychologist in there. Given the difficulty of NT Health in filling those positions, I'll start with this one and then ask you about anything else. If you could, in fact, attract a workforce that was considered bigger in the first place, your evidence to date is that, in fact, that helps with further recruitment.
Exactly.
Any other benefits that Congress has in terms of recruiting for staff that might make it easier for you than NT Health?
Well, just getting back to the psychologist position, because that's interesting in that we've, for whatever reason, we've been able to, we've got currently 15 psychologists at Congress, headcount for an 11 FTE with one vacancy. So I think what that tells us is that working in an Aboriginal community-controlled primary healthcare service, given the structures, the systems, the processes, and we also have a wonderful clinical psychologist that actually sees the benefit of investing in psychologists on the job training, which is seen as a retention and recruitment strategy. I think that has helped with the recruitment of psychologists into Congress.
Are some of those psychologists based in the remote communities that you service?
I'm not sure about. I don't think so. I
So
think
we
it's a
have-
visiting service.
Yeah, we've got resident social workers in each of our remote communities who live there, and visiting psychologists. So we get 2 weeks out of 3 with a psychologist at Kumanjayi, 2 days a week in Dari, 2 days a week at Santa Teresa. But the social workers live there. So it's not just psychologists. You need then Aboriginal care management workers with the team to create. So yeah, we've got resident social and emotional wellbeing staff with visiting psychologists that are there quite a lot of the time. And I think one of the problems with Aboriginal health, if you've got an unfilled position for years, you don't keep funding it. You ask what else can we do with this money? Who else could be? Is there another provider that's better able to actually get someone on the ground and get the service happening? It's a worry to just let a service not happen in a community of high needs for that sort of length of time.
I put this to the witness yesterday, Ms. Heinrich, and I'll put it to you both too, in relation to Yundamu, of course, in terms of the history of the trauma in that community. Starting with the Coniston Massacre, it may go back before then, but the Coniston Massacre was 1928. There have been then the displacement of Aboriginal people in that area, which must itself cause terrible trauma. Then on top of that, there are specific periods like in 2010 when there were riots within that community, meaning that 100 people left the community in 2010 and were repatriated later. And there were children who witnessed violence. There's been cycles of unrest since then. Do you agree that there's an enormous amount of unmet need in terms of the trauma for that community?
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, the tragedy of Kumanjayi's death and the way in which he died and the impact on the community really means it's a crisis of care in terms of trauma-informed practitioners in that community.
Agree completely.
So, Dr. Achi, if I can direct this to you, how do you feel about the fact that that community is currently not supported by a psychologist?
I just can't believe that the position has been left vacant and hasn't been filled, and there haven't been other sort of alternative strategies to try and respond to that unmet need.
Dr. Boffer, is there anything you want to add to that?
Only that when it comes to therapeutic services, I think 50% of the outcome is dependent on relationship, and about 50% is the technical expertise of the practitioner, like for psychologists, whether they use CBT, whether they use transactional therapy, other forms of therapy, is part of their effectiveness. But you've got to have a relationship, you've got to know people, you've got to be there long enough to know people. So it's not just a matter of having someone come even for 6 months and go. This is where you've got to get people that are going to come and stay for a period of time to be effective. Otherwise, people won't come and see them. They want to get to know them. They won't trust them. And that's true for the whole workforce, but it's particularly true for mental health workers. I think they've got to be able to have the ability to form a relationship with the people they're working with.
Do you have communities of the 6 communities that you service that are harder to attract staff to than others?
Oh, I think Mulujulu is probably our main challenge. But, you know, like Dr. Boffer said, we're just about to sign on the dotted line to have a GP for the Mulujulu community.
And even at Munajula, there's a resident social worker, there's a team of nurses, and as I said, there's psychologists 2 days a week, and we're recruiting a permanent psychologist to Yalara for that region who'll live there. So, yeah, it is harder. The more remote you go, the harder it gets. It's almost like a gradient. I think it's pretty true. But you look at the success of the Pinnaby Home Lands Health Service at Kintor, it's a gold standard, I think. It's one of the most remote. They've had a GP there all the time for about 15 years. They've got a lot of staff there. It just shows you can have a team that stays there. The team, a lot of the staff were there for 7, 8 years. And so you can overcome these challenges.
What is it then about Kintor, if we can use that example, Dr. Boffer?
Well, they had a manager that stayed, they had GPs that stayed, they had a team that was, but also your point you made earlier, I think if you think about the modern trend to start talking about a strength-based approach rather than deficit approaches, if you go to a community and you then live in a compound surrounded by barbed wire and you're not allowed to leave, you've got a deficit approach from day one versus becoming part of the community. And not just, as you said, not just part of the Aboriginal community, but the non-Aboriginal community and other organisations. When I went to Tennant Creek in the first year, if I didn't make friends and socialise with the non-Aboriginal staff working for Jalalakari, Junkaraku, I used to play tennis once a week with the principal legal, not once, when the principal legal officer came from Carlis, I'd try and beat him every time he came to Tennant Creek. So you form all these relationships as well as with the Aboriginal community. That's what keeps you there. You then get invited into the life of the community. You get invited to ceremony after a while. If you're in a compound, I know people are doing it to be safe, but then what's the hope of ever getting retention in that environment? So we've got to find a better way of doing this. So at Kintor, there's no, the staff are part of the community and they walk around the community and they socialise with the community. And you can't give up on that if we're going to have an effective primary healthcare service that has an effective relationship with the community. And relationship's key to when you're talking about chronic disease management and lifestyle change, you've got to have a relationship to have those discussions with people, mental health, people that are traumatised. One of the ways trauma expresses itself is shame, and we've all heard the term shame job. That's an expression of trauma, and to overcome that, you've got to have relationships. And so we can't give up on retention, and we can't give up on people who live in the community. As hard as it is, we can solve that problem. It's more expensive. You need new models of housing and communal living, but not with fences. You can have communal living structures where people feel safe without fences around them, where they're actually not just living in isolated houses. And I think there's ways of solving this problem, but if we just can't all move to the idea of people living in gated communities inside, they won't last long. And they won't be very effective. They won't be as effective as they can be.
In terms of addressing trauma, can I ask you this from a clinical perspective? Does the physical environment make a difference to people being able to move forward in terms of their mental health? So, for example, having a living environment which is nicer to be in, having a pool that you can access, having playgrounds that you can go to, having activities. that you can access. Is that important for your mental health?
Absolutely. I mean, probably the best thing you can do for your mental health is exercise. You know, run, whatever, get fit, and also socialise, get out, because in those social occasions comes conversations, and conversations that can help people express how they're really feeling and open up to someone. You know, it's not just a health professional you need to open up. You can open up to a friend, a family member. But those sorts of environments encourage those interactions where people can open up rather than living inside themselves, inside their own house and not talking to people.
So as a I'm asking you a series of Dorothy Dix's, Dr. Boffa, but as a health professional looking at Yuendamu, it needs a whole of government approach, doesn't it, so that we can look at health, housing, education and improving the overall health outcomes of the community involves looking at all those things.
Yeah, but, you know, not just Yuendamu. So remote housing that's our biggest challenge. We would have more resident staff out there now if we had more houses. I mean, you know, in the early years, I was on RIPIC, the Rural Incentives Program. That was a national program to get doctors into remote communities. They funded houses. Those houses have been, there's 12 of them. We got doctors in those houses. So, you've got to build a house, then you attract staff. We've had to put staff in Alice Springs because we don't have houses in our remote communities either. So the housing crisis, I mean, there's a bigger housing crisis for the community. At this current rate of investment, we worked out, even if we do have 200,000, what is it? What's the investment in housing?
1.1 billion.
Yeah, it's 200 million a year.
100 million a year.
Even at 200 million a year, 100 from the territory, 100 from the Commonwealth, it'll take 70 years to get to equity with overcrowding in remote communities. Even if that continues, and it's only on the table for a few years, it's not recurrent. So the housing crisis in remote communities for the community is very significant. But for health professionals, it's a major barrier to getting health professionals into remote communities.
Can Her take it from hearing you both that that's part of the advocacy work that Congress is doing, working with the Department of Housing? Yes,
absolutely. We've been advocating about overcrowding. Actually, would like to know of the 1.1 billion that is to be invested over 10 years, which I think we're into, the third year or fourth year of it, how much of that has actually been expended. And we don't know yet.
And is that's Commonwealth money or a combination of Commonwealth and Territory money?
Mainly NT government allocation, and then the Commonwealth gave an extra $500 million, I think it was.
Yeah, another 100 million a year. So it's 200 million all up for a couple of years at any rate for remote housing. But there's no way of funding, if we want money for health professionals, this only funds community housing, which is great because that's the biggest need, but there is no program to fund new houses for new health staff. Except every now and again you'll get a one-off grant program, and there's some money at the moment for infrastructure, but there's no recurrent infrastructure funding. So you end up having to employ people in Alice Springs to then travel out when some of those people could be in communities.
And want to be in communities.
And so you don't get the sort of benefits that you talked about earlier of being fully integrated into the community unless there
absolutely, you don't.
Can I just move to that topic that you have touched on, which is how Congress clinics deal with managing challenges? You refer in your statement to a particular incident that happened in Mutijulu that you've touched on, and it starts from paragraph 64. You note that Congress has never closed its 24/7 community-based on-call service for medical emergencies. So far, Congress has only had to close one remote clinic for a single weekend. That was in Mutijulu following a crisis that involved violence in the community in 2021. What was that incident, Dr. Achi?
That was community unrest in the community, and some of that unrest was being brought into the clinic, and it sort of built up over time and got to a point where there was damage to the clinic, but there was also the incident of a staff member of another organisation who had been raped, and two of our staff lived either side, so there was a level of anxiety there. So it was a combination of that as well as the sort of impact on the clinic in terms of,
At that time, in 2021, you had a policy called Outreach Remote and Isolated Safe Work Practice. It's attached to your joint statement and appears, I don't need to put it on the screen. That's the note for the review date was the 1st of February 2020, but I think that policy is still the one in place, is that right?
that's right.
So if you could just step through, once the staff expressed their concerns in relation to that incident, was there community consultation before the service had its reduced activity?
Absolutely.
How did that-
We, myself as the Chief Executive Officer, along with the General Manager of Health Services Division, I called a meeting, an urgent meeting of the Health Board, and discussed with the board the concerns that were raised, along with the clinic manager and also a number of the staff. So it was like a meeting of the leadership, the senior management, executive management of Congress, and staff members of the clinic. So it was, and Dr. Boffel was involved as well as our Chief Medical Officer, Public Health, and we went through the issues, and then we went through some of the strategies to deal with that situation.
At that stage, how many staff were in Mutijulu working for the clinic? Just
Four nurses.
And what was the resolution as to how that would be handled?
We relocated those nurses to Ulara, and we continue to provide the service on a daily basis, as well as the after hours service as well. And we instituted a security guard, and the security guard stayed, I think, for, was it 2 weeks? Could have been longer until it settled. And we were also in negotiations with the NT Police, had direct dialogue with, prior to that though, and it was the lead up to this, which probably just moved it along quicker, about the need for a third police officer, and that was finally achieved.
So that was the stakeholders working together to see how that you could resolve that going forward.
Exactly.
And one further police officer is stationed now at Mutijulu as a result of
Yes.
that. In terms of catering for any emergency for Mutijulu while there was reduced services, I think you said that the nurses were moved out to Ulara. Can you tell us how far away Ulara is from Mutijulu?
I think it's 25 k's.
Yep.
So if, for example, someone had an acute cardiac event, you would have an expectation that nurses would travel into the community at that time, is that right?
Yes.
And the on-call services continued?
Yes.
Since that time then, and the clinic was reopened after the weekend, you haven't had to shut since, is that right?
No.
Has there been work with the community to try and resolve any issues from that incident?
Sorry? What?
So
Work with the community.
Work with the community. How does Congress work with the community to try and ensure that that doesn't happen again?
Yeah,
There was a large community meeting that was convened by the council, MRAC, which Congress attended to talk about the problem of violence, squad running, what was causing the violence, what could the community do. And as Donna alluded to, the meetings that she convened at Jamie Chalker's level with senior police, one thing that it immediately did, it meant the 2 police that were there were moved out, and they were part of the problem, unfortunately, and right. 2 new police came straight away. Before then they agreed to the 3rd police presence. So we employed our own security for a while, but we ended up getting an agreement and a commitment to new police, and that meant police person came back who knew the community well, back to this idea, you've got to have relationships. It's true for the police as well. So there was an immediate change in the effectiveness of the local police station, even when it only had 2 police, went up to 3, plus an Aboriginal liaison officer and Aboriginal community police officer. So we had security for a while, so we haven't had to close again. And it's made a difference.
Sorry, but I've just remembered too, the other important thing that was discussed with the board was around the need to, in that conversation with the community, is how can we facilitate a conversation around violence. So our Nginja mail program started doing outreach from Alice Springs down to Mutijulu and started having meetings with senior men in the community about violence in the community. So I started having a conversation about it.
Is that a service offered through Congress?
Yes.
And that means that there's some community, the community take responsibility for part of the unrest, is that right?
Exactly.
So can I suggest that the example you just gave of working with the police there underscores the importance of stakeholders having good relationships as well, being able to work through issues that arise?
Very important.
I've got 2 more topics to cover.
One other quick thing. To get the 3rd police, we had to give up one of our houses. Now, we need that house, but we've given it up because in the end, you don't have a clinic if your staff aren't safe. So in the end, we decided, as much as we needed the house for our own operations, and we've had to have a workaround, and thank goodness the resorts came to the rescue with some accommodation in Yalara. But that, to get a police presence there, we've leased one of our health houses.
And that was supported by the health board.
I see. I take it then that's something that you're trying to, that you want more accommodation in that area as well.
Yeah, we would hope that the police will come up with the resources to actually have their own extra house and we can get that house back.
Dr. Boffa, Dr. Ratchie, I've got 2 more topics to cover. We've been going now since 1:15, or do you need a short break, or does her on it?
No, I'm fine.
I'm fine.
Are you content for me to continue?
I'm content for at least one more topic.
That topic is this. You're familiar with Dr. Kerry-Ann Chilvers, who I think she's in the middle of her PhD, but Ms. Chilvers, who was the psychologist for a period of time, who worked with Kumanjayi in different roles. She was the Mount Theo Outstation Coordinator through WIDAC from 2013 to 2015, a youth case coordinator and program facilitator through the Tamangiri program, and then a community counsellor and psychologist in Yundanu through the remote alcohol and other drug workforce. It's not clear to me currently who funded her during her period as the remote alcohol and other drug workforce counsellor or psychologist. Do you know that, Dr. Boffa?
Yeah, look, the NTPHN received a very significant amount of funding for alcohol and other drug services about 5 years ago. We went through a joint planning exercise under the Northern Territory Aboriginal Health Forum, and that model was built on a psychologist and an Aboriginal case management worker, Aboriginal AOD worker for every community of a certain size across the territory. So when that was distributed, the Northern Territory Department of Health were given 2 positions for the remote communities in Central Australia that they service. Yundanu, being the largest, got the lion's share of 1 position, but there were 2 full-time psychologist positions funded at that time with that funding, and so were positions funded at Bloodawatch, Yurapunja, Pinnaby Homelands. We got mental health services, either social workers or psychologists. Didn't have to be psychologists, but we got them spread out as part of primary healthcare throughout the Northern Territory. It was a very good exercise in needs-based resource allocation.
Dr. Boffa and Dr. Ratchie, I gave you a copy of the statement provided by Ms. Chilvers. She's provided a couple of a statutory declaration and a separate statement. They say much the same thing, but in relation to Ms. Chilvers' statement, it appears in the brief at 8-10. I don't need to put it on the screen. I just wanted to ask you about her evidence.
8:10.
Sorry, if you have a look at her statement at paragraph 9.5.
Right, I'm there. Yep.
And you'll see just at the very top of the page, the reference to 8.10 is just a brief reference. So In her statement, I anticipate she will give this evidence. She's talking about the situation for Kumanjayi in 2018, firstly, and she says in January of that year, she left the Tanangiri program and started working with the remote alcohol and other drug workforce program, where she stayed until June 2019. During that time, you'll see AW, who's Kumanjayi, spent time both in Kapu and in the Alice Springs Correctional Centre, as well as in Yundamu. He successfully completed the Kapu program, and the only issue reported to her was him talking loudly on the phone. So you'll see at paragraph 9.3, she writes, I was advised that he was receiving social and emotional support through Congress while he was in Kapu. Are you aware of what sort of social and emotional support would have been available to a young person like him? In that stage, he was 17 in 2018.
Yeah, okay. Look, so Donna and I have been champions of what we call the 3 streams of care, alcohol and other drug service model. That means you have GP, psychologist, Aboriginal community worker providing care. So we've added that into residential treatment. So into residential treatment, you've got, if you like, social and cultural support and supported accommodation, but you don't have psychologists and you don't have GPs. And you've got to have all 3 to have effective alcohol and other drug treatment. So about 2019, 2018, we developed an MOU with Kapu. We have a GP goes there several sessions a week. Everyone on intake sees the GP, assessed for chronic diseases, medical certificate given, mental health care plan done. Then our psychologists go in and provide therapeutic care to the clients once a week, paid for through Medicare. So that's a service model that could exist in every residential treatment service in the country if they just came to an arrangement with a primary care service. So this client, like all other clients, would have had access to our therapist, who's a psychologist, while in Kapu.
I see. And I've put you on the spot by providing you this statement today. Are you aware now of anybody from Congress who was working with Kumanjayi at that time?
No, I'm not.
No.
We'd have to find out who it was. And certainly this is the first time I've ever seen that there was an attempt made to ask for us to do an assessment. Now, phone calls, email, we'll have to look into this and see whether there is any record of this. But having said that, look, I just think in the area of the NDIS, it's a game changer like Medicare is. Central Australia gets at least $25 million a year now from the NDIS and should be getting a lot more. So if any health professional has got a client who they think could have FASD, there's an obligation on the health professional to make sure the assessment happens. Now, Congress can't be everything to everyone. We've got the only assessment service for neurodevelopment disorders in the country, I think, outside of capital city. We've scrounged money together from 5 different sources. None of it's recurrent. We've got a waiting list of over 200 people, young people and children, to be assessed. We can only complete 2 comprehensive assessments per week. That's neuropsychologist, speech pathologist, occupational therapist, paediatrician, Aboriginal family support worker. It's a team. It takes about 6 weeks to do one assessment. And so all roads lead to Rome. Everyone thinks that we can assess everyone. We can't. We can assess. We've got our main funding contracts with territory families, so we have to give priority 1 to children in child protection and young people in youth detention. And 83% of all young people in youth detention have a neurodevelopmental disorder. Surprise, surprise. That's what other people have found in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So we're really locking up people with neurodevelopmental issues that need NDIS plans. So he should have been assessed, there's no doubt about it, but the health department has obligations to make sure these assessments happen. Now, if this had come to our attention properly, as it did, earlier this year we rung up about a remote community where petrol sniffing outbreak had occurred. They wanted us to assess 20 young people from that community. So I said, look, we've got too big a waiting list, we can't do it. Go to Patches Paediatrics, they'll do it for about $9,000 per assessment. They did do that. That was funded not by government but by CALIS, but I understand only 6 of those young people have been assessed so far. There should be 20. There's another remote community where the paediatrician says 70 children need to be assessed. None of those children have been assessed. So we're doing our level best. We've fought very hard to get the money we've got. We've got it from 5 different funding bodies. None of it's recurrent. We've put a team together, which is impressive. We've got 2 neuropsychologists, 2 speech pathologists. This is a public health issue that has to be addressed. We've been telling the territory government since the NDIS started that they should have transferred all the positions for their old disability service organisation, and there's about 12 of them, to do assessments, not to compete with the NDIS for service delivery. They could have funded a massive assessment service for Central Australia. They didn't. Those positions are competing with the NDIS for service delivery, but the NDIS does not fund assessments. So to get money to fund assessments is difficult. It would, logically, anyone who sat down and thought about it would think it's in the state's interests to get these children assessed, because then they get on a plan. The plan could be worth $60,000, $100,000 a year per young person. That funds services, it brings money into the economy. And why wouldn't the state fund assessment to get access to the NDIS? It's like getting access to Medicare. It's an uncapped program. We could be doing much better here, and it's frustrating to hear, this is almost a bit like cost shifting. If you've got a psychologist who thinks they've got a client who's got FASD, then follow up until the client gets assessed and ask your own department to get the assessment done. Don't just come to Congress, but come to Congress properly, and if you don't get an answer from a phone call, don't give up. We can look into whether there's an email. We're not aware of any of this. We just saw it today, and we'll find out. But I don't think that. I think you've got a duty of care as a professional to do more than that, to make sure a client that you think's got FASD is getting assessed and getting onto the NDIS if they need to get onto the NDIS.
And we'll hear from Kerry Ann Chilvers about it. You're referring to the fact that she notes in her statement, it was around 2018, 2019, that she says she reached out to Congress. We've got her file notes. I'll just remind you, because then I'll ask you a couple of questions about them before we stop for the break. But in Ms Chilvers' document, which for the benefit of those at the bar table is 811, what we see is on the 4th of April, she notes, and I'll just read them to you, Dr. Boffa, but if you wanted to follow it, it's page 34 of her attachments. She notes, for example, on that day, the 9th of April, that she becomes aware of a cognitive assessment undertaken by forensic psychologist Kate Crawley in 2017, and she makes a note here that she arranges for that to be forwarded to Congress. If you look over the page at page 35, she says she makes a phone call to Congress Child and Family Services to find out where to send the referral in for Kumanjayi to be assessed for FASD. There's a message bank. On the 9th of April, there's a note, phone call to Congress Social and Emotional Wellbeing Team, was advised that whilst at Kapu, Kumanjayi had seen Alex, psychologist, Bill Walcott, social worker, and John Paul, manager, was put through to John Paul, left a message on the answering machine. No doubt you can follow that up for your own learnings. But at page 37, the last note that I can see about it is that in June that year, advised Christine of referral to Congress, who haven't got back to me. So putting that to one side, what I suppose I want to suggest to you is that for your service, your concern is that all children in Central Australia, no doubt the whole of the Northern Territory, who need a FASD assessment get one.
And young people.
And
now adults. We've got a lot of acquired brain injury amongst adults. It's a major reason why people become dependent on alcohol.
And it's a major reason why people end up in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, major.
And a major reason why they end up in conflict with police.
Yeah, it's a major reason why we shouldn't turn the tap back on for alcohol.
I'm going to come to that. That's the last topic I'm going to finish with you on, but I'll do that after the break. But just before we leave these FASD assessments, in relation to somebody like, or in relation to anybody, the earlier you get somebody assessed and the earlier you get treatment, the better opportunity you have to intervene. And the cost effectiveness for society is obvious, isn't it, if you get those early interventions and they're effective?
Absolutely.
So it makes sense to get more money in to have these assessments. And in terms of...
Can you tell me, do you see effective interventions?
Yes. We've got what we call the Child Health and Development program, and it's based on the Joseph Sparling model. And what that does is promote enriched caregiving, language, learning games, what is it, John?
Language priority, enriched caregiving, learning games, and conversational reading. Conversational reading. So it's all about stimulating the brain. So that's at the
front end, but then you've got the pointy end, which Dr. Boffer can respond to from a medical perspective. But if you really get in early, you can make a difference with these kids. And it's not just, we've got the data that tells us through the Australian Early Childhood Development Index that tells us that in some of our remote communities in Central Australia, we've got kids that are developmentally vulnerable on 2 or more domains. So the data's telling us we need a systems approach to actual assessments and treatment. Some of those other medical treatments, Bob, you can...
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the capacity for the brain to rewire itself, which is slow stream rehab, which is what you need for to getting on top of FASD, not FASD. I think the classic example is what happened to the petrol sniffers. Someone should do a film like Awaken. So in 2005-06, we were looking after a lot of petrol sniffers who were in nursing homes, supported accommodation, in wheelchairs, couldn't walk, severely brain damaged. Most of those people are now walking, recovered after 10, 15 years. It took a long time, but they're better. So again, with FASD, once you diagnose it, interventions through speech pathology, through occupational therapy, through neuropsychologists with families, and giving good advice to parents about behavioural management and a range of other skills to support these young people, and to the teachers in the schools. You've got to talk to the teachers, and preferably in preschools, but by the time a lot of these kids, you don't really diagnose it till children are 7. So you're talking to primary school teachers, everyone works to a consistent plan, you make a big difference. And we've got the resources now because these kids get an NDIS plan, which is significant resources, and we can get the workforce. And so it's unethical now not to screen children under 5. We're using the ASQ development assessment tool. You've got to screen kids early. You've got to pick these things up early. They've got to be referred. They get an early childhood, early intervention plan. It's all there. But in remote health across the territory, we're still not screening children. We are now assessing. The screening is what comes first, then a more comprehensive assessment with the team I'm talking about. This is all, it's expensive, but the return, it's worth it because we've got the NDIS to fund the treatment. And so we can make a difference to these young people and children, but the diagnosis has to come first. Now, we've diagnosed about 67 children with FASD since 2020 and about 17 with FAS, that's the syndrome, the full syndrome, along with a lot of children with ADHD, global developmental delay. So these things are there in the community. That's the tip of the iceberg. So I think this is an issue. These children will enter school. The longitudinal studies from Canada, which led to the development of the Australian Early Development Census, which assesses all children in the first year of primary school, tells us that children are developmentally vulnerable on 2 or more domains. There's 5 domains. The most important are the emotional domain, which is self-regulation, self-control, and the cognitive domain, which is language. And there's 3 others, social communication, physical development. Children that are developmentally vulnerable on 2 or more domains won't complete year 10. Almost, unless you get them back to normal by age 7, they're going to not complete school. So they've got to have very intensive support in the early years, which is not in just about any of our schools. And so, and the data on the AEDC from the 2021 census is the worst we've seen. So we're not heading in the right direction for the next generation of children. And so it's a huge concern. Now, if we're going to try and turn that around, you've got it, Donna mentioned the Early Childhood Development Centre. That's primary prevention. That's critical. But as well as that, we can diagnose the kids early, and at least that's secondary prevention. What we're doing then is they've already got the issue, but the brain can rewire itself with support, with the right interventions. But it becomes harder and harder. It's the law of diminishing returns. The older the child, the later you start, the more difficult it is and the harder it is to get a good outcome. And if you've got a 14-year-old that's unregulated, can't concentrate, has dropped out of school, engaging them in the therapeutic process for treatment, which is what is difficult. I might say impossible, but difficult. But you've got to, youth detention is late to be picking this up, but it's better to pick it up then than not pick it up at all. And we don't have, there's no similar service in Darwin at all. There's no neuropsychologist in Darwin, and you can't diagnose neurodevelopmental disorders without it. No good having a forensic psychologist. That's just like not useless, but not good enough. You've got to have neuropsychologists, and they've got to be child and adolescent neuropsychologists. People said to us, "You'll never recruit. What do we fund that for? You'll never." We've got 3 that want to come and work. We've got an adult neuropsychologist as well. We would have more if we had more funding. So it's not true that you can't recruit these people to remote areas, but we've got to get it in remote communities around, like, petrol sniffing coming back again this year it's gone again for now. And luckily with Opal Unleaded, it's not addictive, but if you, without going into detail, I just think we're lucky it's not addictive, but it still is harmful if you sniff it the wrong way. So no children died from that outbreak. But prior to Opal Unleaded, we used to see 8 young people a year die in Central Australia of petrol sniffing. So that's gone. We don't want anything to come back. We've had 1 death since 2018 on Opal. So if you sniff Opal for 15 minutes or more, you'll become hypoxic and you can die. So it's still possible, but it didn't spread like a contagion, although it did spread to other communities. So those children need to be assessed. And then there needs to be interventions. And we can't expect the education system to work miracles without a lot of additional support for these sorts of children. And it's not there at the moment. Without, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, because I think we can make a difference here, but we've got to know what we're doing, and we've got to know the extent of the problem. And without screening, we don't know the extent of the problem. Without the ability to assess.
What does screening involve?
Screening involves primary healthcare practitioners, nurses, not so much doctors, nurses, Aboriginal health workers, Aboriginal people doing the ASQ track. So ASQ stands for Ages and Stages Questionnaire. It's done on children all over the country. You assess children, you can assess kids at 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, 2.5. There's lots of stages. That assessment, it's very similar to the AEDC. So you're assessing children's development in those 5 domains, but you're starting early.
Do you do that in your clinic?
Yeah, we do that in our clinics, and we train our staff.
Does Health do it in their clinics?
They're doing it through their FAFT program,
Right.
but it hasn't been systematised in clinics. Now, there's been a bit of resistance from remote area nurses to this, because people say we're too busy, we don't have time. We can assess kids, we can check their weight, their head circumference, we can immunise them, we can do all that. But to do the developmental assessment, which is now more important, most kids are a good weight. The days where we had to worry so much about underweight children are not there, so it's now the development that we need to assess. So this has to be systematised across the primary healthcare system. Everyone has to be trained. It's a 2-day training program. It's not that hard to get trained. You don't have to be a health professional to do this well. Parents love it, because when you do the assessment, parents actually see what it is you're looking at. They see the level of development their children have got. They can see areas where they might need to put in extra effort. It's a great tool, but we haven't systematised it. Although it is a priority for the Anti-Aboriginal Health Forum, it's a priority for the Child and Families Tripilot Forum that Donna chairs to make this happen.
Is it one of your KPIs to measure that?
Not yet.
Not yet.
We've suggested it should be a KPI. We report on it.
But it is a CTG target in terms of bringing down, seeing a reduction in the AEDC scores.
And it did take us many years to crack.
The Australian Early Childhood Development Census assessed data that tells us how bad the situation is.
And
so we want to see
Closing
improvement.
the gap.
Closing the gap.
Yeah. And there was a problem for a few years. It's taken us years to advocate to get access for these kids straight into the NDIS. So until that happened, you could argue it's unethical to screen, because you'd screen, find a problem, nothing would be done. But now, if the child's under 7, and an ASQ track alone will be accepted by the NDIA for an early childhood early intervention plan, and they'll give money up front. And those plans might be $50,000, $60,000 per child, just on the basis of as long as the ASQ track's done by a trained practitioner, they'll accept that as all they need under 7 to access an early childhood early intervention plan which then funds your speech pathology, your OTs, and other. You could fund an Aboriginal family support worker to work with the family. You can do a lot with that package. That's accessible now. So it's unethical not to screen now. It's a problem for the system to not be diagnosing these kids early. I mean, it's hard, under 2, you're only going to pick up kids that have got severe problems as the children get older. By 4, a child that lacks self-regulation is relatively easy to assess by age 4. So you've probably all seen the marshmallow study. You know that one? 1969, that was done. And the kids that were put in a room,
All
and
of us
one marshmallow.
in this room probably would have left the marshmallow.
I think I would have eaten it.
I definitely know that some of my kids would not.
Anyway, so we know how. So self-regulation can be really well assessed by age 4, and then there's the alert program. There's interventions that really make a difference for kids that lack emotional regulation early. And we should be absolutely trying to make sure we've diagnosed every child with that sort of issue by age 4, and we're giving them the benefit of something like the alert program, in their early years of primary school.
And then when we've got kids that are in school, there should be a genuine partnership between the education, between the school and the primary healthcare service. So that's what Dr. Boffa was talking about earlier around learning plans that have in it the actual provision of health services to work with those young kids and to work with the teachers. So it's not left to the school to have to worry for that stuff. They can get on and teach while we, in partnership as a health service, can be working with those kids.
So some clear recommendations on this stuff, and FASD assessment would be really useful.
Dr. Boffa, if we have a go at drafting some of those, I take it that can I impose on you and Dr. Achi to review them for us and add your expertise?
Happy to.
We'll take a 15-minute break and then we'll come back and hear about alcohol. And we'll try not to grab the first marshmallow.
I'm not sure about Mr. Colwich or
I definitely ate all of the.
All stand. The Coronial Court now please stand directly.
No, just I'm just going to do that.